She was 7 the first time she realized no one was coming back for her. That night, she sat on a mattress that smelled like bleach and mildew, clutching a worn-out duffel bag with all her belongings. Her new foster home was quiet to quiet. The woman who greeted her didn't smile, didn't ask questions, just pointed to the room and walked away. Each placement blurred into the next. Different houses, different rules. Sometimes there were other kids, sometimes not. Sometimes there was food on the table, sometimes not. But one thing stayed the same. No one ever said, "You belong here." She learned to stop hoping. That word hope, it became dangerous. A small flame always got snuffed out when she unpacked her bag, only to pack it up again weeks later. She became quiet, observant. Teachers often said she was polite, well-behaved. But what they didn't see were the nights she cried into her pillow, wondering why even her own mother hadn't wanted her. The worst home was the one with the locked fridge. The foster mother smiled at church, but at home, she rationed food and whispered cruel things. She called the girl ungrateful, broken, said she was lucky to even have a roof over her head. That winter, the girl stopped looking in mirrors. She couldn't stand to see someone so invisible. She began to believe what they said, that she'd never be more than a case number, never be more than a damaged child with too much baggage for anyone to love. But somewhere deep inside, in the part of her soul not yet drowned by disappointment, a quiet voice remained. It didn't scream, it didn't beg, it just whispered, "Keep going." And so she did. She stopped trying to be perfect for people who wouldn't care anyway. Instead, she read every book she could find. Stories of underdogs, survivors, people who made something of themselves even when the world had written them off. Those characters became her family. And in their struggles, she saw herself not as a victim, but as someone who could someday rise. Then, one ordinary afternoon in middle school, a teacher noticed her, Miss Donnelly. She didn't ask for her backstory or try to fix her. She simply gave her space to speak in class, praised her essays, and looked her in the eye like she mattered. For the first time, the girl felt seen. It wasn't healing, not yet, but it was a beginning. A single crack of light in a room that had been dark for far too long. High school was a battlefield, but at least now she had armor. It wasn't made of steel, it was made of words. Debate team, poetry slams, even class presentations, anywhere she could use her voice. She stood taller. She learned that speaking her truth didn't make her weak, it made her powerful. Each time she stepped up to the podium, the fear that once paralyzed her melted into something sharper. Purpose. Miss Donnelly had encouraged her to join debate, sensing something in her voice that the girl hadn't yet seen. Her arguments were never the loudest, but they carried something more experienced. When she spoke about justice, about fairness, it wasn't theory, it was memory, and people listened. One afternoon, during a regional competition, a judge pulled her aside. Not a competition judge, an actual retired family court judge named Miriam Tate, there supporting her granddaughter. She had watched the girl deliver a passionate argument about child welfare policies. The judge's eyes had softened. There was recognition in them, something that felt strangely familiar. "Do you know how rare it is to speak with both fire and restraint?" the judge asked gently. "You've seen things, haven't you?" The girl nodded, unsure why her throat felt tight. Judge Tate didn't pry. She simply offered a card and said, "If you ever need someone to talk to about the law, about life, I'd be honored." For weeks, the card sat untouched in her notebook. She didn't know how to trust adults offering kindness. It always came with conditions. But one night, after a rough day in her group home, she called. What followed wasn't dramatic. It was slow, consistent, and warm. A phone call here, a visit there. Judge Tate never pushed, never made promises. She just listened. And in that stillness, the girl found room to grow. By the time she was accepted into college, then law school, she had learned to carry her past, not as shame, but as story. It didn't mean she had healed entirely. Some nights still brought dreams that made her wake up sweating, clutching her sheets like that old duffel bag. But now she had a vision. To stand where Judge Tate had once stood, not just as a voice in a courtroom, but as a protector of those whose stories often go unheard. She kept a photo tucked into her law books, a child, sitting on the edge of a bed, holding a bag too big for her shoulders, a reminder of who she'd been, of who she'd fight for. The courtroom was quiet as she stepped through the doors for her first case as a judge. She had walked into dozens of courtrooms before, first as a terrified child, then as a determined law student. and later as a sharp, soft-spoken attorney. But this was different. This time, she sat at the bench. Her name was etched on the plaque, but the weight of it felt heavier than any gavel. As the bailiff called the room to order, she caught her reflection in the polished wood. Steady eyes, a calm face, a heart racing quietly beneath the robe. She remembered the way it felt to sit on the other side, legs too short to touch the floor, trying to decode the language of adults deciding her fate. Those memories had never really left her. She had carried them like folded paper in her pocket, tucked away but always close. The case was a custody hearing. A 9-year-old girl stood beside her caseworker, eyes wide and silent, much like hers had once been. The foster parents were kind, stable, but there was something fragile in the child's body language, something only someone who had lived that silence could recognize. The judge, this former foster child, didn't just look at the paperwork. She looked at the girl, truly looked. And when she spoke, her voice didn't echo with authority. It wrapped around the courtroom like a blanket. Her questions weren't just about logistics, they were about safety, dreams, bedtime routines, what the girl liked to read. The courtroom shifted. Hardened expressions softened. The girl blinked. For the first time in the hearing, she smiled. Afterward, the clerk said, "You handled that beautifully, like you'd been doing it forever." She smiled politely, but inside, her heart swelled. She hadn't just survived, she had returned to the very system that tried to break her, not for revenge, but to rewrite the story, to be the one person who might tip the scale, just enough, for another child. Later that evening, she sat in her chambers alone. Her robe hung neatly on a hook. On the desk was a handwritten note from Judge Tate, who had passed away just a month before her appointment. The note simply read, "You were never invisible. You were becoming." Tears welled in her eyes, not out of sadness, but release. All those years of pain, silence, and being passed around, they hadn't been for nothing. They were the soil from which she had grown. She wasn't just a judge. She was proof that where you come from doesn't decide who you become. Sometimes, the most broken paths lead to the strongest foundations. She didn't rise in spite of her pain, she rose because of it. The little girl who once carried her world in a duffel bag, now carried the responsibility of changing others' worlds with her voice, her wisdom, and her compassion. Her story reminds us that we are not the product of our beginnings, but of the strength we choose to carry forward. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to believe in second chances. Like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to the tales we share for more human stories that move the soul.